I'm Andrew Ross. I've been teaching here at NYU since 1993. I'm the son of a refugee myself to the UK, and I'm also an immigrant to the US. I came here in the late 1970s. I guess when people ask me how I should identify myself, I usually say I'm a New Yorker. I think that's usually the safest thing to say in my case, and I feel pretty good about that. Let's begin by acknowledging that we're meeting here on occupied Lenape land. And from an indigenous perspective, and without presuming to know anything about your family backgrounds, let's just accept that from an indigenous perspective, most of us here are settlers, and we are complicit, each in our own ways, in the continuing and violent process of displacing indigenous peoples from these lands. Now, distinctions matter, of course. We didn't all come in the same boats. Our families didn't all come in the same boats, and which boat your family came on matters. Whether your family came by invitation because of their skills and labor, whether they came under indenture, whether they came under conditions of forced slavery or because of debt bondage, or whether they were fleeing persecution or poverty, whether they came because of the impact of U.S. militarism in some other part of the world, or indeed whether they came as climate refugees, because increasingly a number of climate refugees in this country. We all came in different boats, as Martin Luther King Jr. would say. But we are all in the same boat now. The U.S. is supposed to be a haven. It's supposed to be a nation of immigrants as well as a settler colonial nation, maybe even a sanctuary for some. But of course, it's never been an equal opportunity haven. And always selectively favoring the right kind of stranger by assigning and denying citizenship, property and voting rights in an equally selective fashion, and most typically by race and skin color and gender. And of course, in addition, at some points, we know that the U.S. closed the immigration door entirely, beginning probably most notably with the Chinese Exclusion Acts in 1882, and then there was the big door closing in 1924, and the Asian Exclusion Acts, which were part of that closing of the door. And it seems that today the U.S. once again is becoming an unwelcoming nation, let's say, if we could put it that way, with the current White House administration pursuing policies of criminalization and deportation in a very stepped-up fashion. Since President Trump took office, we've seen several efforts to do that. The so-called Muslim travel ban, currently affecting everyone from 6 countries. And technically speaking, an executive order called Protecting the Nation from Foreign Terrorist Entry into the United States. That's what the travel ban is called, or initially was. We've seen the ongoing efforts to end DACA, the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, and efforts to deport the Dreamers, currently being used as a political football on Capitol Hill, even as we speak. And also the decision most recently to end TPS, which is temporary protected status for immigrants who left countries decimated by civil conflicts or natural disasters or what have you. And more generally, the stepped-up effort to take enact hardline policies, and many others who entered this country without documents and made a home here for many, many years, sometimes decades. And for those of you who feel somewhat dismayed and probably even outraged by the exclusion policies adopted by the Trump administration, it's important to know some of the history behind them, which is one of the goals of this course. It's important to know that immigration law in the U.S., for example, has always been, I think I could say, an instrument of white supremacy. That does not mitigate or excuse the extremism of the moment, but in the course of this seminar, I expect that the many, many instructors who will be appearing before you will be reminding you of that fact. As I said at the beginning, the history component is kind of important because, the actions of the current administration, while they may appear to be dramatic, un-American breaks with U.S. custom, are far from it. President Trump's targeting of populations that have been labeled criminal aliens and border security threats. This treatment is really a kind of amped up version of the policies of the previous occupant of the White House. And I think it's important to say that. The Obama administration, after all, used these buzzwords also to deport as many as 3 million people from the United States. Most of these were recent border crossers and not long-time residents, which is a kind of distinction you might want to make. But let's be clear, when we say deport, that can often mean a death sentence. And it's not to be taken or used lightly or in an offhand fashion. Although the decision to deport is often taken by a judge in an offhand fashion, looking at paperwork, shuffling through paperwork in some chaotic courtroom, some chaotic ICE hearing, and that decision he or she makes, it will be a death sentence. Someone described it as indeed like handing out a death sentence in a traffic court. That's often what it feels like for those who've been witnesses. And that person then is often sent into a very life-threatening situation. I also want to say that, of course, the administration's rhetoric, while extreme and offensive, does draw upon very deep and long-standing currents of fear and hatred, race hatred, that have always been fundamental to U.S. cultural politics. Again, that's not to say that the contemporary mentality of white nationalism is any less disturbing and normal, but you can't understand its appeal without knowing something about this history and analyzing its historical roots and customs. Similarly with sanctuary and the new sanctuary movement, we're going to be talking a little bit, in this class at least, about the historical components of that concept and that practice or custom. Now, above all, it seems that although we tend to, because it's our backyard and where we live, we tend to focus on the US, but we can't really afford to be too provincial because this is a global issue, and there are very few countries that are doing a good job with regard to migration, refugees, and sanctuary. And globally speaking, there are more refugees than at any other point in modern history right now. The UN last year, UN Refugee Agency reported that 65.6 million people around the world have been forced from their homes. Now that is a very large, that's more than the population of the UK. That's one, for what it's worth, is 1 in every 113 people on the planet. Someone is displaced every 3 seconds. And among that number, if you break down that number, 22.5 million are cross-border refugees, over half of them under the age of 18. Well, more than 40 million are displaced within their own country, so they're internally displaced. There are also 10 million stateless people who have been denied a nationality and access to basic rights like education and health care and what have you. Things, of course, that we as U.S. citizens have immediate access to. I'm joking. I mention these numbers because, and it's important for the UN and sort of almost endemic to the UN sense of mission, because these numbers now surpass the previous record, which was after the Second World War. There were 60 million Europeans displaced after the Second World War, and for several years they were subsisting in vast camps, refugee camps, and displaced persons camps. And in order to respond to that crisis, the first sort of proto-UN organization was thrown together, the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, which actually preceded the formation of the UN itself. And I mention that because the UN, which was formed shortly afterwards, it's interesting to think of the UN as a kind of, in large part, a response to this refugee crisis. It's been there from its very roots and its very formation. I know that's not how, in the public mind, you think about the UN, but in the context of this class, we're inviting you to do so. The UN and its agencies were very much a response to this crisis of displacement. Now, that wasn't the end of the story, of course. Shortly after the end of the war, a wave of decolonization swept through the world, especially the global south, as the colonial powers of Europe decided to pull out of colony after colony. And they wound down and dismantled their empires, and most of them, or certainly some of them, departed in a great hurry. And with disastrous consequences, they made very hasty and high-handed efforts to partition multi-ethnic and pluralistic populations that they had ruled over or had administered, which is to say they drew some lines on a map very quickly in order to divide populations from each other, populations that they perceived to be antagonistic towards each other. And these were antagonisms that they had, in fact, encouraged under the colonial policy of divide and rule, right? Some of you know this history. And then they sort of invited or encouraged or forced the populations to take sides on one side of the line or the other that had been drawn on the map. So this is 2018, and this year is the anniversary, the 70th anniversary of two of these partitions, which generated massive displacements of population. They were, of course, Israel, Palestine, Mandate Palestine,
and then India, Pakistan.
India,
Yeah.
and Pakistan, what became Pakistan. They were the two most notable ones, that year at least. And 14.5 million people were displaced when the partition line was drawn in India. And huge numbers of populations are still living with the consequences of that line being drawn today. And then more than 750,000 indigenous Palestinians were also displaced, expelled, chased out of their homes and off their lands, and forced into exile in Mandate Palestine. And this was during what Palestinians call the Nakba. There's a program of ethnic cleansing that was a response to partition. The UN, in this case it was the UN that produced the partition plan, but very much at the instigation of the British mandatory power. These refugees were dispersed throughout the Middle East. They become the biggest and most permanent body of refugees in the world, registered refugees in the world. Some of you here today might belong to some of those families. And the UN created a special agency called UNRWA, UNRWA, to cater to the needs of that particular population. UNRWA is in the news right now because, anyone know why UNRWA is in the news right now in particular? Something to do with President Trump? Rose?
He's saying that he's going to defund UNRWA until Palestinians, particularly Abbas, comes to the negotiating table with him.
Not totally defund,
Yeah,
but certainly
I think like 65.
almost cut in half the U.S. contribution to UNRWA, which is a particularly cruel and inhumane measure to take, because UNRWA basically provides a lot of the healthcare and educational needs of the refugee camp population. The UN has, of course, some of you know, periodically affirmed the right of these families, number 5.7 million now worldwide, periodically affirmed the right of these families to return to their homes, but that prospect seems remote at this point in time. However, if you've ever visited a Palestinian refugee camp, as I did 2 weeks ago, you will see that the resolve to return has remained very passionate and strong, and is still very much in the minds even of the third generation living in these camps. They still hold on to the keys of the homes from which their families were expelled, and they don't allow anything in the refugee camp to look as if it's anything more than temporary, in order to preempt the appearance of being permanent resettlement environment. And they're very particular about this. The determination of Palestinians, refugees, to exercise their right to return is one of the longest running stories about the legacy of decolonization, but precisely because it was a direct result of a new wave of colonization by Zionist settlers. And you could say that by contrast, the right of return of indigenous peoples who were displaced in earlier waves of settler colonialism in countries like this, for example, or all across the Americas, is not covered in the same way by international laws or UN conventions, which tend to focus on the right to self-determination, let's say, rather than the right to return. While we're talking about 1948, also a very important event that happened in 1948, Declaration for Human Rights. Very important. Drafted, again, in large part to respond to the refugee crisis. And Article 14 in particular is of relevance to us this evening. It says, everyone has the right to seek and to enjoy in other countries asylum from persecution. Right? Everyone has the right to seek and to enjoy in other countries asylum from persecution. And this article becomes the basis for the United Nations Convention relating to the status of refugees, which was subsequently adopted in 1951, and it is the centerpiece, has been the centerpiece of international refugee protection ever since then, still is today. At that time, the protection was limited to refugees who were living in Europe before 1951, and that was the only coverage. But over time, and in fact, I think in around about 1967, they removed the geographic and the temporal limits so that it applies worldwide to everyone, to all refugees. It's a one-stop shopping for all refugees when it comes to protection. There had been earlier international refugee legal instruments, but this one collected them all and produced one single comprehensive definition to rule over all the others. A refugee, according to the convention, a refugee is someone who is unable or unwilling to return to their country of origin owing to a well-founded fear of being persecuted for reasons of race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular social group, or political opinion. And the convention is underpinned by a number of fundamental principles, and I guess that the three cardinal ones are non-discrimination, non-penalization, and non-refoulement. And let me just say something briefly about each. Non-discrimination is the most straightforward. It means that these provisions that are in the convention are to be applied without discrimination as to race, religion, country of origin, sex, age, disability, sexuality, or other prohibited grounds. The second one is non-penalization, and that applies to the very common reality that refugees who are seeking asylum sometimes have to break the laws of a country in order to get into that country. Right? They have to break the immigration laws. It's sort of common sense in a way, but it doesn't go without saying, because the tendency of border enforcement agents is to penalize people who break immigration laws. Again, it doesn't go without saying. That's what they're trained to do. But the convention, the 1951 UN Convention, prohibits that from happening, and it protects them if they have indeed broken any laws and you cannot be charged with criminal offenses relating to the seeking out of asylum, the act of trying to find a country that will accept you and protect you. The last one is the safeguard against expulsion of refugees, and it's called non-refoulement. It's very fundamental, and it means that no one shall expel or return, and that the French word is refouler, refoulement, we call it in our version of French. No one can expel or return a refugee against his or her will in any manner whatsoever to the territory where he or she fears the threat to her life or her freedom. And also, there are other things in the convention which you can look into. It does grant some rights to refugees, including access to courts, primary education, work, and also what else? Provision for documentation, some kind of something that looks like a passport, right? But not a real passport, but something that passes for a passport. Okay, so all very well. States sign on to this convention and they all abide by all these fine rules, right? Not. This just doesn't happen in many cases, and that's part of the problem. The problem is one of enforcement. Many countries, some countries that we think of as particularly nefarious when it comes to the record of human rights have signed on to this. But they don't enforce the rules, they don't abide by them, and even if they do, it's important to realize that many refugees leave behind one zone of trauma and enter another. When they enter the country that might be host, that might actually award them asylum, they encounter all sorts of other trauma. Not necessarily the same kind of trauma. They may be fleeing war, but they don't necessarily arrive to find peace. Why? Well, because in the country that's supposed to be sheltering them, they're often targeted in inhumane ways. They may be fleeing displacement, they may be fleeing racial and xenophobic violence, political terror, but many of them encounter these things in other forms and other versions in the streets and in the institutions of the country that is now hosting them. Some of them may not indeed have encountered racism at all in their countries of origin, but they're guaranteed to encounter racism here in the US. And just to give you one non-US example of this, and just because a lot of my current research is there, I'm going to return to the Middle East and to just give you a little account of what's happening to refugees in Israel. Many of you know that civil wars erupted in the Hook of Africa, in Eastern Africa, in the early 2000s, and they displaced a lot of people. Refugees made their way mostly north, and many of them came to Israel, and they were mostly from Eritrea and Sudan, Darfur, and they made their way into Israel from 2006 onwards. Now, Israel is a signatory to the 1951 convention, the UN convention, and so it was obliged to admit the refugees, and doing so was a big boost to that country's quite tarnished reputation as an occupying nation in violation of a long list of international laws. It so happens that Israel's record of accepting refugees is actually is very poor. They've only awarded asylum to 200 people since 1948, which is an extraordinary scarce number. That's less than 1% of all refugee claimants. But once these African refugees were in Israel, they faced the unwelcome prospect of being treated very badly or being treated as a temporary inconvenience. Israel's hard-line leadership, Zionist leadership, defines it as a Jewish nation, despite the fact that 20% of its citizens are Palestinian, and it zealously denies any rights to non-Jews. whether they're the children of migrant workers who are born in Israel, whether they're West Bank Palestinians who've been living under 50 years of occupation, whose families have lived there for many centuries, and least of all, to African refugees, as you can imagine. Israel officially is not an immigrant nation, is defined as a place of return for Jews around the world. And so it won't surprise you to know that human rights claims made on behalf of refugees under the 1951 Convention inflamed a lot of very right-wing Zionist opinion in Israel, and they began to be labeled as existential threats to the country's Jewish national identity, and they were labeled as infiltrators. And infiltrator is a very loaded term because it was a term that was used to apply to Palestinians who tried to make their way back to their homes after the Nakba in 1948. So the persecution of these African refugees in daily life is encouraged from above by political leadership at the same time as from the everyday racism, let's say, which is present in the general population, not just in Israel, but in many countries, especially settler colonial countries. And until recently, thousands of these refugees were kept in wretched conditions in a detention complex in Holot, a detention camp in the Negev desert, in the temperature extremes of the Negev desert. And after a while, the government decided, well, we're going to try and deport these refugees, and first of all, let's try self-deportation. Right, this is a principle that is often tried. It usually fails in the case of refugees, and it failed in the case of Israel. But basically it's, we'll make your life so miserable that you'll just want to leave. It's that simple. Right? That's the basic principle of self-deportation. As I said, it doesn't really work very well. So in recent years, forced deportation has become the preferred policy. And most recently, the decision, either leave or you will be put in real prison, not just a detention camp, but you'll be put in prison for real. That's the choice that's been given to those refugees. For those who are willing to leave, they can't be returned to their home countries because of the principle of refoulement. So what happens is that countries like Rwanda and Uganda have been offered $5,000 a head for accepting these refugees. And in some cases they have gone. They're not particularly welcome in Rwanda or Uganda either. And so they don't stay there very long, and those who have tracked them have found a lot of them end up in detention camps in the middle of Libya on their way to Europe, which is where they want to go. And why is that? That's because of arrangements that European countries like Italy have made with Libya and other North African countries to arrest the transit of refugees before they even get to the Mediterranean. What that means is that the southern border of Europe is effectively now in the middle of North Africa. And you can find points along the way where that is effectively the case. Okay, let's go back to the U.S. The U.S. is an immigrant nation, unlike Israel. And also, unlike Israel, it has a multi-ethnic society. It has managed to become a multi-ethnic society in spite of its white supremacy, capable of absorbing refugees, and it has done so in much greater numbers than Israel. But it has been very selective indeed, especially in the Cold War era. The Cold War decades, when granting refugee status, when granting asylum was very much a political tool on the part of U.S. governments. So from 1945 through the 1980s, the U.S. admitted 2 million refugees and granted them asylum. And most of them came from Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Soviet Union itself, Poland, and also Iran and Afghanistan, and of course the one country to the south of us, which falls into that category, Cuba. And you could add those populations from Southeast Asia, who were fleeing from communism after the U.S. withdrawal of military forces from Vietnam and Cambodia. A tiny number were from non-communist countries. Indeed, large numbers who were trying to flee from right-wing dictatorships in places like Haiti, Vachan, and Chile, for that matter. They were rejected. They were denied asylum. And then during the 1980s, we probably read for today, those of you who managed to do the readings for today, as many as 1 million Salvadorian and Guatemalan and Nicaraguans sought refuge here. And they were fleeing anti-communist death squads in those countries during the so-called dirty wars that the U.S. supported and funded in the 1980s. And the U.S. did not allow them to qualify for asylum. After all, the U.S. was funding and supporting the governments that were imposing the death squads in these populations. So stands to reason, if we're paying to have them killed down there, why would we let them into this country, right? It doesn't make any sense, right? Why would we welcome people in this country who we were trying to kill? So what happened was that the U.S. authorities declared nearly all refugees from these countries to be economic migrants, right? Maybe fleeing poverty at the worst, but for the most part, looking to better their economic situation, which doesn't exactly qualify under the UN Convention of Refugees for asylum. And the U.S. government repatriated the vast majority of refugees, and many of them to the deadly conditions or the life-threatening conditions that they had escaped, and many were killed on being returned there in the 1980s. And it's in these conditions and under those circumstances that the first sanctuary movement arises in the Southwest initially, but then it spreads out from the border states and becomes more of a sort of nationwide movement, but not fully nationwide. And that's what we refer to as the first sanctuary movement. It's initiated by faith-based groups who decided to act in violation of U.S. laws and provide physical refuge to those fleeing those wars. And by the way, ICE, of course, is still deporting Salvadorians, and except these days, they can always be taken up in the global market for migrant labor. In fact, last week I read that a lot of Salvadorians being deported from this country are being recruited to work in, does anyone know this story? In which country? Yes, Qatar in particular. Qatar is taking a lot of them. I don't know why. I don't know what the actual arrangement is, except perhaps that the dominant labor pool, migrant labor pool in Qatar is South Asian, and it's come under a lot of scrutiny recently because of human rights and labor rights abuses in Qatar. And maybe there's just a little too much scrutiny, too much exposure of people dying in construction sites there in large numbers. And so what we're going to do is just switch the population out. We'll bring Salvadorians in. Maybe they're more hardy, and they won't die. They won't die so quickly in construction sites there. Why is this so easy to do at a time when many high-income countries, and Qatar is a high-income country, at least for its own citizens, its own native citizens, why is that so easy to do when so many high-income countries are closing their borders, right? Like this one, and European countries. Well, the majority of residents in the Gulf states are indeed migrant workers, and a large percentage of rich countries have migrant workers in their ranks as a low-income labor force, as I'm sure you know. And the supply and the need and the demand and the market for migrant labor is very much dependent on uneven capitalist development, and also the rules of free trade that underpin corporate globalization that has set in motion vast populations of people. And I mentioned earlier on the number that has peaked it hasn't stopped, but it peaked this year, of refugees. If we look at the numbers of migrants in the world, it's even greater. The number of international migrants, these are people living in a country other than their country of birth, is now 258 million people. And that's a lot. And even more staggering is the increase since the year 2000. It's almost doubled in number since 2000, which is amazing given what you think might have happened since 2000, with anti-immigrant sentiment on the rise, let's say, since that period of time. These cross-border migrants come at all skill levels. You know, they include the most educated and the least skilled. And they are set in motion for many different reasons. I mean, primarily they're economic migrants, but many of them increasingly displaced by climate change now. And we're seeing an exponential rise in the number of climate refugees going forward. It's only really just beginning in a sense, but guaranteed to mushroom in the decades to come. And many of these climate refugees, we are asking whether they should be eligible for asylum or considered as meriting sanctuary, even though there's nothing in international law and certainly nothing in the UN Convention on Refugees that applies to anything like climate migrants. Now, before we go any further with this, with the story about sanctuary here in the US, let's establish that the churches that initiated sanctuary movement back in the 1980s did not invent sanctuary. It's a very old idea, and nor is it specifically from the Judeo-Christian traditions. And you find this concept in ancient societies, pre-monotheistic societies, where temples often functioned as places of temporary refuge for those seeking, for those who are fleeing persecution, are accused of breaking temporal laws. They fall under the authority of the gods when they reach these temples, and the authority of gods prevails over the authority of earthly laws and earthly rulers and their laws. And where in general, I guess one way of thinking about it, the idea or the spirit of welcoming the stranger is also observed. And in some cases, historically, you can see how this tradition was absorbed into common law rather than canon law, or religious law. In medieval England, it entered into common law. There was an English medieval ordinance which provided for sanctuary protections in churches for those who were fleeing from pursuers who were trying to bring them to justice for some violation of this law or that law. Once they stepped over the threshold, they were good. They could not be touched. And in fact, not only that, but it was the obligation of the community that was pursuing them to provide for them for up to 40 days. And during that 40 days, mercy was sought out and often obtained from the authorities. A deal was made. It's a period when you can make a deal. It was a cooling off period, right? People stepped back from pursuing them and considered whatever precept of charity might be in their minds and whatever precept of mercy might be in their minds. And a deal was made, often involving confession and then exile. But the 40 days of sanctuary was this cooling off period which at least staved off the immediate threat of being, strung up or executed or put on hasty trial, let's say, rushed to judgment. Now, the Middle Ages are also, I want to mention that one other thing, incredibly generalized thing about the Middle Ages, because we can do that sometimes from our vantage point. The other thing is that the Middle Ages are the heyday of the walled city. And the walled city is important as a concept and as a built environment, the political economy of a built environment, because the walls are synonymous with belonging and with citizenship in many walled cities in the Middle Ages. and they are exclusive borders. They are in many ways a prototype of exclusive borders. Right? We are here inside, the barbarians are outside, they cannot come in here, they're excluded. And this is the model in many ways from which the modern nation state arises. And the model for exclusion, the exclusion zone that is the modern nation state, where borders have a similar kind of function and significance. And in some ways it is the exact opposite of sanctuary. The concept of the walled city is the exact opposite of sanctuary. Sanctuary, you cross the threshold, you're welcome. Doesn't matter who you are, no questions asked. As long as you're inside, you're in a safe space. And this is the antithesis of the walled city and the modern nation state. Now, in the U.S., again, we're moving very fast and furiously through history here. In the U.S., there is a rich history of sanctuary. And the highlights include, as you probably know, the Underground Railroad, which is a network of safe houses and routes which harbored slaves, escaped slaves from the South. And we also, in parallel with that, we also have the resistance to the Fugitive Slave Acts at the time, which took all sorts of forms, whereby individual states and courts helped slaves to freedom by obstructing the federal government, obstructing these federal laws, by passing state laws that prohibited officials from assisting in recapturing the slaves and returning them to the South. And in many ways, again, these are the prototypes. They're the same kinds of powers that today sanctuary cities are trying to invoke. When you declare yourself to be a sanctuary city, you say our law enforcement authorities will not assist immigration officials or immigration authorities in apprehending whoever they are pursuing. And as of January the 1st, we don't just have sanctuary cities, we also have sanctuary state. Right? Who was the first sanctuary state to declare itself as a sanctuary state? California. Uber Alice. California took a step that vastly limits who state and local law enforcement agencies can hold, question, and transfer at the request of federal immigration authorities. And California took that step to shield more than 2.3 million immigrants living without documents in the state. It's important to know that it does not, and Alina might go into more detail and clarify this, it does not prevent ICE or Homeland Security agents from doing their job. That law in and of itself, it just says, you won't get any help from us. We can't stop you from going in there and doing what the federal law tells you to do, but we're not going to help you in any way whatsoever. These are your laws and not ours. We also have, I should add, we also have an underground tradition of safe houses and refuges for political activists and left-wing activists in particular, including most conspicuously during the Civil Rights era and the Vietnam War. And lastly, of course, there are, and I'll say last but not least, there are universities, campuses, which grew out of monastic settlements in Europe, have long struggled to be havens of protected speech. Our codes of academic freedom, which apply to us within the walls of the campus, NYU doesn't have walls like some campuses, but and also outside the walls for those of us who leave the precincts. These codes of academic freedom do protect our collective right to voice opinions that our employer and our government might not care for. But there's nothing they can do about it because academic freedom protects us and allows us to, teach whatever we like within limits and say whatever we like. These walls protect us to some extent, and they are a precious kind of sanctuary. And in fact, the former president of NYU, much maligned former president, John Saxon, wrote a position paper which is still on the NYU website, which is you could look at with some profit, called the University a sanctuary. I mean, there are parts of it which make sense, obviously. There are other parts that pay lip service to things that we might hold more dearly. But it's a different, I think the point I would make is it's a different concept of sanctuary than the one that we think of today. And in fact, the current president of NYU, in common with most other university presidents, won't recognize this university as a sanctuary, won't give it the label of a sanctuary campus. So let me just go back to the first sanctuary movement then, which for those of you, anyone here from Tucson? No? You're very proud if you were, because that's where the first sanctuary movement, I mean, Tucson, you can be proud of many things in Tucson, but they headquartered, initially at least, in the south side, the United Presbyterian Church, whose minister openly declared that it would oppose the immigration authorities' operations in order to protect, not just protect asylum seekers, but also to expose the fact that they had been set in motion by US-sponsored wars in Central America. So it's important that these two steps, that these two things were always there. And that's what politicized, in some sense, what might have been seen as an act of charity. But when you go out of your way to point out that these people are here because of US politics, because of US geopolitics, then you take a step further and you begin to operationalize or politicize the concept of charity beyond its limits, let's say. And so over 10 years, space of 10 years or so, the duration of the first sanctuary movement, over 500 congregations nationwide joined the movement, offering transportation and shelter and food and legal aid and medical care. And as the movement grew, about 20 governments, city and state governments, also joined by passing policies of non-cooperation with the INS, and indeed a kind of a network of safe spaces and routes of escape also evolved, not unlike the Underground Railroad during those years, for passing along refugees, at least initially to Canada, until the US leaned on Canada and squelched that at a certain point. The Reagan administration, which was in charge of the country at the time, tried to criminalize this movement. Indeed, as the current administration might try to do today, hasn't actually taken that step, although many people would believe or could very easily predict it would take that step of criminalizing the new sanctuary movement. And what that meant is the FBI is asked to launch a campaign of dirty tricks against the movement, and the Justice Department starts to initiate criminal proceedings. And there were many high-profile so-called sanctuary trials that took place during this period, and they were trials for criminal conspiracy and for aiding, and I quote, aiding illegal aliens to enter the United States by shielding, harboring, and transporting them. The last big trial was in Arizona in 1985, and it was very much a kind of media circus. It turned into a very public condemnation of US policy. So at that point, this was a kind of a very high watermark of exposing US policy in fomenting these wars in Central America. And most of the defendants in the trials were convicted, but none of them, as far as I know, were sentenced to jail time. And the course of the 1980s, the legislature eventually turned in favor of harboring those refugees. Congress in 1990 passed legislation to grant temporary protected status to Central Americans in need of safe haven. Although it wasn't really until 1997, the Nicaraguan Adjustment and Central American Relief Act, that Congress allowed Central Americans to apply for permanent residence. And by that time, 1997, the movement, the sanctuary movement, had kind of petered out, lost a lot of its steam and momentum and maybe sense of purpose or function. And then not long afterwards, in 2006, it was revived and repurposed. What happened in the ensuing years? What important event happened between 1997 and 2006? In 9/11, yeah. And 9/11 is very important, of course, for all sorts of reasons. It's a big watershed event in this history. It changed the immigration landscape. It generated new enemies for the US, which is very important for a superpower. It has to have enemies. And it launched a series of wars that you have, almost all of you probably, have lived through, have lived with during your entire lifespan. By far the majority of you have grown up not knowing the US to have been at peace. Has always been at war, which makes you unique among Americans. For what it's worth, the US has never been at war, however you conceive of that, for so long. And there's no end in sight, it seems, which is important. Now, some of you might argue that the Cold War, which went on for a long time, was not a real war, in the sense that not many white people were killed. That's how the U.S. sometimes defines or thinks in public perception of real wars, but it was a long series of very hot proxy wars that were fought all over the world, mostly in the global south, in which tens of millions died in Asia and Africa and Latin America. But there was always the idea that it could end, right? The Cold War always, there was a prospect that it could end, and it did end in 1990 or thereabouts. And that left the US in a very precarious position, a very odd and dangerous position for a superpower to be in, because there was no adequate enemy left in the world. And if you are a warrior culture, which we are, very much a warrior culture, and our economy is so dependent on military expenditure, not to have an adequate enemy in the world is a very bewildering place to be. It's not easy to carry on with business as usual. And so for the best part of the next decade, the US geopolitically is floundering around looking for an enemy in the world to justify its huge military expenditures, and also to instill fear in its domestic population, not just fear but also hatred among our citizens, because that is the dominant form of social control and a way of doing business, as we know, or as some of you know, in this society. So how do you justify the vast treasure we spend on militarism without an adequate enemy? Well, 9/11 came along and solved that problem, right? It handed us not just a new enemy, but a number of new enemies on a plate, on a platter. Very fortuitous. And particularly so because the war on terror that was launched in the wake of 9/11 was a war that, unlike the Cold War, this is a war that need never end, because the adversary is a very shadowy threat and very ill-defined and very vaguely defined, and can very easily be a label that can be attributed to almost any population. So this is a war that might never end. It doesn't in principle have to end, and therefore it's very serviceable. And the enemy conjured up in the American public mind, in a narrow sense at least, if I could characterize it, that in the narrow sense these would be Islamists, but in the broader sense all Muslims, since the religion itself has been subject to racial profiling in the intervening years, and in a geographical sense almost anyone from the Middle East or North Africa, Central and Southern Asia. So there are vast populations that were nominated as potential threats, as potential enemies and adversaries in the years after 9/11, and they continue to be regarded with suspicion by US authorities and by large portions of the American public, if we can believe what is often said and reported, at least. And this is, what is this? Is a threat from the east, right? If you could characterize it that way. It's a highly serviceable threat, again, as I said, for a warrior culture with very deep roots in Judeo-Christian traditions, Judeo-Christian culture. And we're also a culture that can rely for stimulation on a very keen appetite for white Christian nationalism and white supremacy. That's the threat from the east. The threat from the south is another matter. It's somewhat different in some regards, but it's been linked in the public mind nonetheless. It's always been there, but the nativist and the anti-Muslim profiling, which we saw in the wake of 9/11, presented an opening for that kind of mentality of profiling to be projected onto the threat from the south. And very soon we heard a lot of talk about terrorists infiltrating the U.S. through the border with Mexico, and this was an opening, therefore, as you can see, presented an opening for anti-Latinx nativists to push this kind of talk. But in the public mind, it's probably fair to say that the stereotypical stock image of the threat is not, let's say, the suicide bomber, which is a sort of over-concentrated version, or the iconic version of the threat from the east, but rather the image of belligerent masculinity that is the Mexican or Central American criminal rapist. In the public mind, this is the kind of stereotype that's been encouraged, and certainly by our current president when he summons up this talk about bad hombres. That's what it's intended to do. It's intended to have a sort of association with sexual menace, often homicidal, but definitely intended to be some kind of rapist. Again, unlike and by contrast, the Islamic terrorist stereotype, who it is assumed, again in the American public mind, has no aggressive sexual interest in violating white women's bodies, even though the intent may be there to discipline the independent sexuality of these bodies. And here, again, I'm just paraphrasing stereotypes for the purpose of making generalizations about the public mind. And lastly, you could say that the threat from the south is not primarily driven by or associated with religious hostility, primarily, although it is often framed as a culture war, especially in the Crusades for English only, or in the Crusades to expunge ethnic studies in public education, which target Latinx populations. So for the most part, the threat from the south is a very familiar cocktail of racism and economic anxiety, has a much longer and more recognizable history among white nativists. But I think what we've seen is an upgrading of that. There have been some new elements added to the cocktail, which is very familiar. And these are the borderist, immigrationist elements that we've become familiar with in recent years, which resulted after 9/11 in the creation of Homeland Security. And they're particularly toxic additions. I mean, the cocktail is toxic enough to begin with, but these are particularly toxic